I left my husband while 8 months pregnant. He laughed until he came home to an empty apartment, and then I met Derek in the fall of 2017 during a small community theater production in downtown Baltimore. I was in charge of costume design, knee-deep in alterations, caffeine, and frayed threads, while he was the lead, charismatic, a little too confident, and the kind of guy who always made sure everyone knew when he entered a room. He had that kind of energy that fills up a space and makes it hard to look anywhere else. Back then, I was just getting out of a long relationship and was in no mood for anything serious. But Derek had a way of making you feel like the sun only rose for you. He talked like he was born to be famous, flirted like it was a performance, and chased me like I was the final act in his show. By early 2019, we were married in a tiny garden ceremony behind a friend's art studio. It wasn't the wedding I dreamed of as a girl, but I told myself love didn't need chandeliers or centerpieces. At that point, I still thought Derek was just quirky and a little self-involved, like most artists I'd worked with. When he got frustrated, he'd sulk and disappear into his music or games, but I chalked it up to creative temperament. I made excuses because I believed in us. Or maybe I just didn't want to start over again. I found out I was pregnant on a cold December morning in 2022. I was standing barefoot in the kitchen, still half asleep, holding the test like it was going to tell me the lottery numbers. My heart raced and my mouth went dry. It wasn't planned, and Derek and I had never really talked seriously about kids. I knew it would change everything, but even in the shock, I felt this strange mix of terror and awe. I imagined the tiny person inside me growing fingers, a spine, maybe my nose, or his dimples. When I told Derek that night, he just stared at me, then forced a tight smile. He said all the right things. We'll figure it out. I've got you. This is our next adventure. But I could see something behind his eyes that didn't match his words. Like he was already calculating the escape route. The first trimester nearly wrecked me. I was nauseous constantly, throwing up so much I kept a bucket next to the bed and another under my desk. I couldn't keep anything down except for saltines and ginger ale, and I lost weight instead of gaining. Derek stopped coming to appointments after the first one, saying the waiting rooms gave him anxiety. He spent most of his time locked in the spare room with his gaming headset on, yelling at his friends through the mic and slamming energy drinks until 3 in the morning. At first, I told myself he just needed time to adjust, that men handle pregnancy differently, that maybe his way of coping was just checking out temporarily. But even then, I knew that I was lying to myself because the truth was too heavy to face. Things hit a wall on a Wednesday afternoon when I was 7 months along and trying to be practical about groceries. My back had been killing me for weeks, and the anemia had kicked in hard, so I was dragging myself through work during the day and crashing the second I got home. That afternoon, I stopped at Trader Joe's on the way back, grabbing everything we needed for the week. By the time I parked on the street outside our third-floor walk-up, I could already feel my lower back start to cramp. There was no elevator in the building, just the same old cracked stairs with the loose handrail that no one ever fixed. I walked through the front door, struggling with the first few bags, and found Derek exactly where I'd left him that morning. On the couch, headset on, game controller in hand, surrounded by half-empty energy drinks and the remnants of last night's pizza. I asked him, breathless, if he could help me carry the rest up from the car, and he didn't even look at me when he waved me off and said he was in the middle of something important. So I went back down. Again and again. 6 trips up and down those stairs, belly out front, legs swollen, arms sore. On the last trip, I nearly tripped because the bag was digging into my wrist so hard I lost feeling in my fingers. When I finally got everything into the kitchen, I dropped the bags and leaned against the counter, drenched in sweat and completely out of breath. I didn't even notice the tears until I wiped my face with my sleeve and realized they weren't just from the physical pain. Derek looked up from the couch like he'd just noticed I was in the room, stared at me for a second, and said, "You're seriously getting disgusting to look at. You better drop that weight fast after the baby, or I'm finding someone who takes care of herself." He said it like he was commenting on the weather. Casual, bored, and through his headset, I heard the laughter of his gaming friends, none of whom I've ever met in person. He wanted them to hear it. He wanted me to feel humiliated. He wanted to be the guy with the fat, hormonal wife who was still dumb enough to take care of his shit. I think he expected me to scream, maybe cry, maybe throw something. But I didn't do any of that. I smiled. I walked over to him, kissed his forehead like I was playing a role, and told him I needed a shower. The confused look on his face would have been funny if I hadn't been dying inside. I locked the bathroom door, turned the water on as hot as I could stand it, and sobbed silently until I felt empty. They weren't weak tears, they were rage tears. Wake-up call tears. Clarity tears. It was like someone took the last 5 years of my life and set them in order for the first time. Everything I'd ignored. Every red flag I'd explained away. Every insult disguised as humor. Every promise he never kept. All of it suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. When I stepped out of the shower, I didn't feel broken. I felt done. Quietly, utterly done. I put on the softest maternity dress I owned, tied my wet hair up in a bun, and packed the bag I'd already had ready for the hospital because I'm a planner like that. I added my laptop, important documents, my planner, and whatever cash I had in the fireproof box we kept under the sink. Derek didn't even look up when I said I needed some air. I don't think he even heard me. I got into my car and drove 20 minutes away to a little hotel near the Beltway that didn't ask questions and let me pay with a card he didn't have access to. I locked the door behind me, curled up in bed, and tried to process what had just happened. My baby was kicking like crazy, like she could feel the shift in my body and knew something had changed. I put my hand on my stomach and whispered, "I've got you. We're going to be okay." And for the first time since that second pink line showed up on the test, I actually believed it. That night in the hotel, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the apartment. The sink piled high with dirty dishes I'd washed a dozen times over. The indentation on the couch where Derek lived most of his days. The baby clothes I'd folded alone while he shouted insults at teammates online. I lay on the stiff mattress in a hoodie that barely zipped over my belly, one hand on my stomach, the other holding my phone like it was a lifeline. I wasn't crying anymore. Something had hardened inside me, and I knew it wasn't going to soften again. By morning, I had 3 missed calls from Derek and 1 text that simply said, "Where's the leftover pasta?" Not a single word asking where I was. No concern. No apology. Just an entitled man-child wanting dinner like nothing had happened. That was the moment I stopped worrying whether I was overreacting. I wasn't being irrational, hormonal, or dramatic. I was being clear-eyed for the first time in years. I called my sister Trina around 6:45 a.m., knowing she'd be up early wrangling her twins before school. I hadn't told her much about what had been going on at home, partly out of embarrassment and partly because I was so used to minimizing things that it felt wrong to call them abuse. But the moment she answered and heard my voice, something in her tone shifted. "Where are you?" she asked immediately, already sensing something was off. I told her everything in one breathless ramble. The grocery bags, the headset laughter, the disgust in Derek's voice, and the awful, numb clarity that followed. Trina didn't hesitate. She said she'd drive up from Richmond that weekend and help me figure out a plan. She didn't try to talk me into anything. She just listened, reassured me that I wasn't crazy, and asked me what I needed right now. I told her I didn't know, and that was the truth. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to that apartment until I had something concrete in place. That meant money, a plan, and an exit I could execute without Derek realizing what was happening. The next day, I returned to the apartment because I had no choice. I was still paying half the rent. My name was on every utility and bill. My job was in Baltimore. I couldn't just live out of a hotel for another month. So I pulled into our parking lot late in the afternoon and forced myself up the stairs like I was walking back into a trap. Derek greeted me like nothing had happened. He grinned when he saw me and said, "You were gone a while. I figured you'd calm down eventually." No apology. No accountability. Just smugness wrapped in fake charm. When I brought up his comment about my body, trying to keep my voice calm, he rolled his eyes so hard it looked painful and muttered, "You know I was joking. God, Maya, you've been so moody lately. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells all the time." Then he had the audacity to say, "Do you have any idea how hard this pregnancy's been for me?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. But I took a breath, smiled weakly, and said maybe I was just tired and hormonal. The relief on his face was immediate. He thought I was back in line. He thought I'd snapped back into the version of me he could control. He had no idea I was already consulting with a divorce attorney. The following weeks were a balancing act between pretending to be his supportive, forgiving wife and quietly dismantling the life we'd built together. I began documenting every cruel remark, every neglectful incident, and every time he said something that made my skin crawl. I kept a detailed journal in a password-protected app. When he said something especially cutting, I'd record it on my phone. I knew Maryland was a one-party consent state. I checked everything twice. I wasn't taking chances. I set up a new bank account at a credit union he didn't know about and had my direct deposit rerouted. Since I already had my paycheck going to my own account, the switch wasn't hard, just a small form at work and a fake excuse about bank errors. Slowly, I began transferring small amounts from our shared account to my private one. Never more than $100 at a time, spaced days apart, always around the time bills were being paid, so it looked like routine budgeting. While combing through our online banking, I stumbled across something that made my stomach turn. Derek had opened a credit card in my name. I had never seen the account before, never received a statement. The balance was over $4,800, almost all of it spent on computer hardware, audio gear, and gaming subscriptions. I sat there in disbelief, reading through the charges while our daughter kicked inside me like she knew exactly what kind of chaos she'd been born into. I took screenshots of everything and called the card company. They opened a fraud case immediately. It was the one time I was thankful for all the emails I'd kept and receipts I never threw away. My sister Trina came up 2 weekends in a row to help me look at apartments. I needed something ground floor, with a washer and dryer in unit, and close to the hospital. We found a small 2-bedroom in Hampton, old but freshly renovated, with a secure entrance and good lighting. I signed the lease quietly, paying the deposit in cash from my private savings. I gave them a friend's phone number as my emergency contact, so it wouldn't ping to Trina or raise any red flags. When Derek wasn't home, I started gathering things. Just little pieces at first. My birth certificate, our marriage license, tax documents, insurance files, jewelry I didn't wear often but wanted to keep, baby clothes I'd bought with my own money. I brought them to Trina's place in small batches, hidden inside tote bags under laundry or tucked behind bags of returns. He never noticed. He rarely looked up from his screen long enough to ask where I'd been, let alone where I was going. The worst part was pretending. I had to laugh at his jokes. I had to cook his meals. I had to crawl into bed next to him at night while he snored with one arm flung across my belly like he had some right to be there. I had to let him believe he'd won, that his cruelty had broken me back in his submission, while every cell in my body fought not to flinch at his touch. It made me sick, but I reminded myself I had to hold on just a little longer, just until everything was ready. Then came the night that made me hate him more than I thought I could. I came home from work, limping from back pain so bad I had to use the wall to steady myself. Derek's friends were already there, 3 of them, all shouting into headsets and downing beers like it was a frat house. I hadn't been told anyone was coming. I was so exhausted I couldn't see straight. I walked past them to the bedroom, lay on my side, and tried to breathe through the spasms in my spine. 10 minutes later, Derek walked in, leaned against the doorframe, and said, "Hey, you should make yourself useful and order us some pizza." When I said I was in pain, he scoffed and replied, "Being pregnant isn't a disability. My mom worked up until the day before I was born." That would have been a real zinger if it were true. I checked later with his mom during a casual call, and she told me she'd been on bed rest for the final month due to high blood pressure. Classic Derek. The guys heard everything. One of them even looked like he wanted to say something, but stayed quiet. I ordered pizza from bed, paid for it myself, and when it arrived, Derek yelled for me to get the door because he was mid-match. I hauled myself up, answered the door in my pajamas, paid, and laid out plates and napkins while they barely acknowledged me. I was 8 months pregnant, swollen, nauseated, and still expected to play waitress. That night, after they left and the apartment was trashed with beer cans and greasy boxes, Derek climbed into bed and tried to initiate sex. I told him I was tired and in pain. He rolled over and muttered, "Come on, it's not like you need to do anything. Just lie there like you always do." I walked into the bathroom, locked the door, and sobbed silently into a towel so he wouldn't hear. I stared at my reflection in the mirror and didn't even recognize myself. Then I looked down at my belly, at the life growing inside me, and I whispered the same words I'd said at the hotel. "I've got you. We're going to be okay." Because we had to be. We were running out of time. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. My body was reaching its breaking point, and so was my spirit. Every day I spent under that roof chipped away at whatever scraps of peace I had left. The insomnia had gotten worse. My feet were so swollen I couldn't wear anything but soft slippers, and the baby had started to press so hard against my ribs that I sometimes gasped mid-sentence. But the emotional exhaustion, that was worse. Pretending every single day that everything was fine, that I had forgiven him, that I was still somehow in love with a man who saw me as disposable, had worn me down to the bone. The plan was already in motion, and I just needed one final opportunity to execute it. That came when Derek mentioned that he'd be heading to his dad's place in Lancaster for the weekend. His father was turning 65, and Derek wanted to drive down alone and get a break before the baby gets here. He said it like he was the one doing all the hard work. I didn't argue. I nodded and told him it was a good idea. I even offered to pack his overnight bag so he could relax and not stress about it. He smiled at me like he thought I was finally back to being the docile, grateful wife he'd trained me to be. The moment he walked out that door with his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, humming along to some band no one cared about, I didn't wait a second. I watched his car pull out of the parking lot and turn the corner before locking the apartment door behind me and grabbing my list. Operation Exodus had officially begun. I had exactly 32 hours before he was scheduled to return. 10 minutes later, Trina pulled up in her SUV. She looked like she was preparing for a tactical mission. Hair tied up, gloves on, no-nonsense face. Right behind her was my best friend Marla, driving a boxy little moving truck her coworker let her borrow for the weekend. Jesse, Derek's younger brother, showed up 20 minutes later, looking nervous but determined. I wasn't sure if he'd actually come. He'd only contacted me once after seeing Derek lose it over something small, burn eggs, if you can believe that, and told me he was sorry for not saying anything sooner. I hadn't told him exactly what we were doing, only that I needed help moving something important while Derek was gone. The second he stepped through the door and saw the empty boxes and the stripped crib mattress, he nodded silently like he already knew. I didn't waste time on nostalgia. 5 years of pretending, enduring, and sacrificing was not something I needed to mourn. I walked through each room with the checklist I'd made on a legal pad, marking off every item that was mine, bought before or without Derek, or given to me directly. Trina moved quickly through the kitchen, packing up the dishes from my grandmother, the blender I'd bought with my own paycheck, and the tiny espresso machine that had become my sole indulgence before pregnancy. Marla tackled the bedroom, carefully folding my clothes and keeping a running list of everything she packed. Jesse, to his credit, handled all the heavy lifting. He didn't ask questions. At one point, while moving my dresser, he stopped mid-hallway, looked at me, and said, "Maya, I know he's my brother, but what he did to you, it's not okay. Our mom didn't raise us to be like that." That nearly broke me. I wanted to hug him, but I couldn't even move because my body was already screaming from just standing. We worked until sunset, stopping only to eat cold slices of pizza while sitting on the floor surrounded by half-packed boxes and baby clothes. It was strange, this little moment of comfort and laughter among people who actually gave a damn about me. People who weren't pretending. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was suffocating. I felt like someone had cracked a window in a room I didn't know had air. After we'd loaded most of my belongings into the truck, we locked the apartment and drove everything over to my new place. The difference was staggering. It was small, yes, but it was clean and quiet. The kitchen smelled like fresh paint. There were big windows in the living room and a sliding glass door that opened to a tiny patio. My bedroom faced a tree-lined street where birds chirped instead of the constant screech of Derek's headset and the bass from his speakers. It felt like safety, like something I could build a life in. The next morning, Sore and running on 3 hours of sleep, I went back with Trina to finish the last phase. I deep cleaned the apartment, not for him, but for myself. I wanted no part of him to say I'd left things a mess. I packed my last few things: books, a handmade quilt from my aunt, my sketch pads, and some of the baby's toys still in packaging. Then I sat at the kitchen table and laid everything out. I left the divorce papers right in the center, signed and filed, ready for service. Next to them was a folder with copies of the financial statements showing the fraudulent credit card charges, the screenshots of his purchases, and the claim number I'd received from the credit card company. A USB drive sat on top, clearly labeled, with the audio files I'd recorded over the past 2 months. Every demeaning remark, every argument he twisted, every insult he thought I'd forget. And finally, the note I'd written a dozen times in my head, but only once on paper. It said, "Find someone better from your couch." I already have. I didn't take everything. I left the couch, the bed frame, the flat-screen TV he was obsessed with, and most of the shared furniture we'd bought together. I did, however, take photos of every room, every item left behind, and every surface I scrubbed, just in case he tried to accuse me of vandalism or theft. I wasn't interested in playing petty games, but I was absolutely ready to protect myself. Before we left, I unplugged his precious gaming PC, the one he'd charged to a card in my name without asking, and packed it carefully in its original box. I told Jesse he didn't have to carry that part if it made him uncomfortable. He just looked at me, shook his head, and said, "No, he needs to learn what consequences look like." And then he carried it right out to the truck. Back at my new apartment, I collapsed onto the floor with a box of pizza and a warm can of ginger ale, surrounded by people who had proven themselves more family to me than Derek ever had. It wasn't perfect. The crib was still in pieces, my back felt like it might snap, and I could barely keep my eyes open, but it was mine. All of it was mine. The keys in my hand, the lease in my name, the life ahead of me, it was finally mine. I waited until we'd unpacked the last box before I picked up my phone and called Derek. I didn't expect him to answer, and he didn't. I left a voicemail, short and to the point, letting him know he would find everything he needed in the apartment. Then I sent a follow-up text with the same information and blocked his number. I emailed his parents that evening, detailing the separation and making it clear that I was safe, and that any further contact from Derek would need to go through my attorney. It took less than an hour for the calls to start from unknown numbers, clearly Derek using his friends' phones. I didn't answer any of them. Trina's neighbor, bless her heart, sent us a video she took around 11 p.m. that night. Derek had shown up at Trina's front door, pounding on it and yelling like a lunatic, demanding to talk and fix things. She never opened the door, but she saved the footage in case we needed to file a police report. When I checked my email the next morning, Derek had sent another message. This one was softer, full of empty apologies, sudden promises to go to therapy, and pathetic pleas to give him another chance. He said he didn't realize how badly he'd treated me, that he'd change, that he loved me and couldn't live without me. What struck me was how none of it mentioned our daughter. None of it acknowledged the pregnancy or how his behavior might have affected the baby growing inside me. It was all about him, his pain, his confusion, his redemption arc. I didn't reply. My lawyer told me not to, and honestly, I had nothing to say. That day, Trina and I started setting up the nursery. It wasn't much, a simple white crib, a soft rug, a rocking chair I bought secondhand, but it was mine. I hung tiny cloud decals above the crib and folded the first newborn onesie into the top drawer. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know how I'd manage everything alone. But as I looked around that room, for the first time in months, I wasn't scared. I was free. And freedom, I realized, felt a lot like breathing again. Derek showed up to the old apartment a day earlier than he said he would, and I only found out because Jesse called me after Derek practically tore the place apart. According to Jesse, he walked into the apartment expecting his same old setup: controller on the coffee table, me folding laundry nearby, food waiting in the fridge, but instead he found silence, bare counters, and the gaming setup boxed and gone. The first thing he did was call me, obviously forgetting I'd blocked him. And then he started calling everyone we knew. He called Marla twice, even though they were barely acquaintances. He left voicemails for Trina's husband, and when no one responded, he started sending angry emails filled with insults and melodramatic rants about betrayal and abandonment. Within hours, the shift happened. The rage turned into desperation. One email said I was cruel and heartless, that I was robbing him of his family. The next promised therapy, church, sobriety, whatever I needed, followed by another message that blamed me for destroying our marriage over a joke. I read them all, even though I shouldn't have. Part of me still wanted to believe that maybe, deep down, there had once been a version of him that loved me. But the way every message turned back into guilt-tripping or vague threats made it obvious. He didn't miss me, he missed control. What really stunned me was how quickly he turned to performative grief. Within 48 hours of my leaving, his social media lit up with filtered photos of us during better days. Old selfies at the lake, a picture from our wedding, a blurry shot of our first Christmas tree. The captions were all the same kind of hollow poetry. You never know what you had until it's gone. Trying to find the pieces of my heart. His friends, most of whom hadn't seen us in person in over a year, flooded the comments with sympathy and praise. Stay strong, bro. She'll come around. You were always a great guy. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't try to correct the narrative or defend myself online. I was too tired, too focused on getting my new place ready and staying calm for the baby. My blood pressure had spiked during the move, and my doctor warned me that the stress was putting me at risk. Every day, I reminded myself that silence was power and distance was peace. 2 weeks after I moved out, I went into labor unexpectedly. I was only 37 weeks along, but the doctor said it wasn't uncommon, especially given the stress I'd been under for so long. Trina drove me to the hospital while I clutched her hand so tightly my knuckles turned white. We'd planned for this, thankfully. My hospital bag was packed. The route was memorized. But nothing could have prepared me for how fast everything moved once we arrived. 19 hours of contractions. 3 full hours of pushing. My legs shook the whole time, and at one point I thought I might actually pass out. Then at 6:42 in the morning, my daughter entered the world screaming like she already knew how to fight. They laid her on my chest, and everything went still. She had a tiny nose, wrinkled hands, and the softest cry I'd ever heard. I looked down at her, all of 5 pounds and change, and I knew in that second that every moment of pain, doubt, and fear had been worth it. I whispered her name, Nora, and she blinked up at me like she already knew me. Trina was crying in the corner, trying to hold it together. I didn't realize I was crying too until a nurse handed me a tissue. I didn't tell Derek I was in labor. I didn't even think about him once during those 19 hours. The next day, after I'd had a little sleep and Nora had passed all her newborn tests, I emailed him a photo. Not one of us together, just her, wrapped in the hospital blanket, eyes closed and safe. I told him her full name, the time of birth, her weight, and that she was healthy. That was it. No emotion, no invitation, no opening. His response was exactly what I expected. First came the all-caps rage about not being called during labor, how I was using the baby as a weapon, and that I was deliberately keeping his daughter from him. Then, about 2 hours later, came a more measured reply saying he wanted to see her immediately and be involved as a father. My lawyer handled everything from that point forward. We began the process of setting up a formal visitation agreement through the court, because I knew better than to trust a single word that came from him directly. The court agreed to supervised visitation, 4 hours, every other Saturday, in a neutral location. Derek didn't like that one bit. He said it made him feel like a criminal. He said it was demeaning and unnecessary. But we had documentation, recordings, proof of financial fraud, and a whole paper trail that painted a very different picture than the one he was sharing with his friends on social media. The judge didn't flinch. The agreement was signed. The clock started. He showed up to the first visit 40 minutes late, dressed like he was going to a music festival, reeking of whatever cologne he thought would cover up stale beer. He held Nora for 15 minutes, took a few photos to post later, and spent the rest of the time telling the court-appointed supervisor how unfair the whole thing was. He called me bitter. He said I was trying to ruin him. He didn't even bring a bottle or ask what kind she liked. The next visit, 2 weeks later, was shorter. She cried for most of it. He looked uncomfortable, asked if she was always this fussy, and left early. After that, he started canceling. Once because he had a studio session. Once because of a migraine. The third time he just didn't show, no explanation. Each missed visit was logged by the supervisor, and my lawyer added them to our file. I wasn't surprised. I'd spent years waiting on him to show up in our relationship. I wasn't going to waste time expecting anything different now. At home, Nora was thriving. She was sleeping in short stretches, eating well, and already holding her head up like a determined little storm. Trina stayed with me for the first 2 weeks, helping with night feedings and making sure I got rest. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in postpartum trauma and emotional abuse. It was the first time someone had looked at me and said, with no hesitation, "What you went through was real. You weren't imagining it." I needed that. I hadn't realized just how much I needed to be believed. There were still hard nights. The kind where Nora wouldn't sleep and the silence of the apartment felt too loud. But every time I looked at her tiny hands and those serious, beautiful eyes, I remembered exactly why I'd left. I didn't want her to grow up thinking love was cruelty disguised as loyalty, or silence passed off as strength. I wanted her to grow up knowing that love means effort, kindness, and presence, not manipulation, power, or fear. She deserved better. And finally, so did I. It's been almost a year since that night I left everything behind with a packed bag and a belly full of resolve. Nora is nearly 10 months old now, and every morning when I walk into her room and see her beaming up at me from her crib with her wild bedhead and those gummy, mischievous smiles, I'm reminded that freedom sometimes begins with heartbreak. She's crawling now, fast and curious, obsessed with pulling herself up and knocking over anything that isn't nailed down. She babbles constantly, as if she has 100 stories to tell already, and when I laugh, she always joins in like we're sharing a secret no one else gets. The divorce is final. It wasn't easy, and it sure as hell wasn't clean, but it's over. Derek fought every single thing he could, not because he wanted any of it back, but because he hated the idea of losing. He tried to contest custody despite skipping more than half his scheduled visits. He demanded full ownership of the apartment we had already vacated. He even tried to claim ownership of my car, which I had bought outright before we ever met. His arguments were weak, desperate, and backed by nothing but bruised ego. My lawyer shut every one of them down, piece by piece, without breaking a sweat. In the end, I was awarded full physical custody of Nora. Derek gets 4 hours of supervised visitation per month, though he hasn't shown up in over 3. Child support was calculated based on his real income, which turned out to be higher than what he'd claimed on paper, and the judge wasn't sympathetic when we presented evidence of the fraudulent credit card and his verbal abuse. I walked away with what was mine, what I had earned, and most importantly, my daughter's future intact. As for Derek, last I heard from Jesse, he's telling anyone who will listen that I lost my mind after giving birth, and that I stole both his kid and his money. He conveniently leaves out the part where he weaponized shame, stole my credit to fund his gaming, and humiliated me in front of his friends while I was carrying his child. I don't care about correcting the story anymore. The people who matter know the truth, and those who don't were never worth worrying about to begin with. Financially, things are stable. I've become painfully good at budgeting, but it's worth every sacrifice. I work part-time from home doing freelance design, and between that and the child support, Nora has everything she needs. We're not swimming in luxury, but we're safe, warm, and never in need. I've started a small savings account in her name, adding whatever I can, even if it's just a few dollars here and there. It feels good to build something again, something solid and real, even if it's slow and quiet. I've also started seeing someone new. We met through mutual friends, and it's early, cautious, and nothing like the whirlwind Derek swept me into years ago. He knows everything, not because I overshared, but because he asked and then just listened without interrupting. He shows up when he says he will. He holds Nora like she's the most fragile thing in the world, and when she screams mid-bottle or throws food at the wall, he doesn't flinch. We're not rushing anything. I'm not looking for someone to save me. I've already done that for myself. Trina visits nearly every weekend. She's still my rock, my sounding board, and the person who believed in me before I remembered how to believe in myself. Sometimes we sit on the porch after Nora goes to bed, and she'll look at me and say, "Do you remember who you used to be?" I do. I remember the woman who tiptoed around her husband's moods, who cried in the shower so no one would hear, who thought that keeping a family together at any cost was a badge of honor. That version of me is gone. What's left is someone stronger, quieter, and more certain than she ever imagined she could be. There are still scars, of course. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, thinking I hear Derek's voice in the hallway or feel his weight in the bed beside me. Trauma doesn't evaporate just because the danger has passed, but I've learned how to sit with it. I've learned how to breathe through the panic, to remind myself I'm safe, that Nora is safe, and that we're building something no one can take away this time. The last thing I'll say is this. If you're reading this and wondering if your relationship is as bad as it feels, if you're making excuses for someone who chips away at you day after day, please stop waiting for the moment it gets worse enough to justify leaving. That moment already came. You don't need his permission or anyone else's approval to choose yourself. You don't need to be bleeding to be worthy of escape. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't leave bruises. They leave silence, loneliness, a dull ache in the center of your chest every night. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was also the smartest, the kindest, and the most necessary. My daughter will never grow up watching her mother shrink to keep the peace. She'll grow up knowing that her mother walked away from something broken, not because she wasn't strong enough to stay, but because she was finally strong enough to go.